Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the velvet curtain of medieval history and into a world far stranger than the sanitized legends we're used to. You see, beyond the crests, the crowns, and the pious portraits lies something far more chaotic. The private lives of kings. Lavish, grotesque, scandalous. These were the rulers who turned palaces into dens of excess and rule books into punchlines. So before you sink into your chair or your bed or wherever you prefer to dive into historical madness, take a second to pause and appreciate that you don't live in a time when dinner with the king could mean losing your title, your wife, or your sense of decency. Dim the lights, maybe crack a window for ambiance, and let's begin our descent. Our first unfortunate soul on this royal parade of misrule is John of England. Perhaps better remembered as the man who somehow managed to lose half of France while offending the entire British aristocracy in a single reign. His nicknames were many: John Lackland, John Softsword, but none capture his chaotic essence quite like his historical reputation. This was a king so reviled by his contemporaries that even the chroniclers, men who usually skipped over executions and heresy, felt the need to comment on just how improper he truly was. When medieval scribes, known for ignoring witch burnings and peasant floggings, pause to call someone unrestrained around women, you know you're dealing with a royal disaster. John's reign from 1199 to 1216 was a masterclass in how not to rule a kingdom or a household. He was politically disastrous, militarily inept, and personally catastrophic. Most monarchs had affairs. John conducted them like sieges. He didn't simply woo noble women. He seized them, often removing them from their homes by force and keeping them hidden within castle walls, as if love were a matter of incarceration. This wasn't passion, it was policy. When he couldn't undermine an enemy through war, he aimed for something far more personal: their marriages. His strategy was unsettlingly effective. Want to weaken a baron? Seduce his wife. Want to ensure loyalty? Threaten the virtue of his daughter. It's less Game of Thrones and more diplomatic home-wrecking. One nobleman reportedly refused to host John unless his entire family was locked in a separate building. You know you've failed as a dinner guest when someone builds a bunker to protect their household from you. It was not just the scandal, but the sheer efficiency of it that shocked his peers. John's behavior blurred the line between seduction and statecraft. He had dozens of lovers, possibly more. Some were willing, others coerced. At one point, official court documents listed over 30 mistresses. 30. That's not romance. That's a royal HR nightmare. The problem wasn't just the volume, it was the consequences. Rebellions brewed not over taxation, not over foreign wars, but over noblemen terrified that the king might arrive and lay claim to their wives and estates in equal measure. Yet John, in his delusion, believed he was charming. Letters survive where he praises his own allure, though no third-party verification has ever emerged. To him, power and seduction were intertwined. And perhaps, in his twisted view, his behavior was justified. After all, kings were answerable only to God. Except, of course, when the barons came knocking with a charter in hand and a sword at his throat. In 1215, the infamous Magna Carta was born, not simply because of poor governance, but because the nobility had grown tired of a monarch who couldn't keep his ambitions or his hands to himself. John signed the document reluctantly, under pressure, and then promptly ignored it. Within a year, war erupted again. By the time he died in 1216, John had left a trail of burned alliances, illegitimate children, and a country on the brink of collapse. His death came not with fanfare, but with dysentery, contracted while fleeing rebellion. Fitting, really. A king whose rule was marked by bad decisions and worse dinners, ending his days in a fevered mess of regret and bodily failure. History does not remember him fondly, and for good reason. He was not the worst king in European history, but he may have been the most personally reviled. A monarch who turned lust into legislation, who saw women as tools and nobles as obstacles. He is the kind of ruler who made the concept of checks and balances not just a theory, but a desperate necessity. Not so much a king as a cautionary tale with a crown. Charles VI of France, remembered less for his policies than for his unpredictable descent into madness, began his reign cloaked in promise. He was young, striking, charismatic. Crowned in 1380, he looked every inch the royal heir, tall, clear-eyed, educated. France, weary from years of war and political unrest, allowed itself a moment of cautious hope. Perhaps this king, this golden-haired boy with his gentle speech and regal bearing, might finally bring peace and order to a fractured realm. But fate had other plans. Or perhaps it was heredity, or stress, or something darker and inexplicable that gradually chipped away at Charles's mind. Whatever the cause, the young king who once inspired confidence would soon become the object of terror, confusion, and pity. It didn't happen all at once. The first signs were strange, but not alarming. A moment of confusion here, a mood swing there, whispers that the king was having trouble remembering names, faces, or why he had entered a room. Advisors brushed it off. Stress, they said. Overwork. But the signs grew harder to ignore. Charles began acting out violently, lashing out at courtiers and knights who had done nothing more than glance in his direction. On one infamous occasion, during a journey through a forest, he suddenly turned on his own guards with drawn sword, striking down several before being restrained. Then came the delusions. Not vague paranoia or garden variety melancholy, but deep, immersive hallucinations that swallowed his grasp on reality. Most famously, Charles came to believe that his body was made of glass. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. He insisted that he must be wrapped in heavy cloth or padded garments to prevent himself from shattering. He refused to be touched. He avoided movement. He was convinced that one wrong step, one fall, and he would splinter into 1,000 glittering shards. His attendants were forced to tiptoe around him, sometimes literally, wrapping his limbs in layers of fabric, cushioning his chair, watching as he shuffled about the palace like a ghost terrified of his own reflection. And reflection, it turned out, was no comfort. Mirrors, he believed, mocked him. He began to avoid them altogether, frightened not of what he might see, but of what might step through the glass to take his place. Yet somehow, amid this turmoil, Charles still carried on the performative aspects of kingship. The crown sat on his brow. The court held its ceremonies. The charade continued because in monarchy, appearances are sometimes more powerful than truth. But behind the curtain, it was chaos. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, was left to manage the kingdom. No easy task, considering half the nobles wanted power, and the other half wanted the king committed. She walked a fine line, publicly loyal, privately desperate. And then, as if things weren't unstable enough, Charles insisted on bringing his mistress, Odette de Champdiver, into the palace. She wasn't a passing fancy. She was declared a source of comfort, and perhaps she was in her own way. Odette remained by his side through the worst of his episodes. She combed his hair when he feared his scalp might split. She listened as he spoke of demons in the walls and voices in the fire. She helped him into his protective layers when the fear of shattering became too much. It's hard to know what held them together, love, duty, or the strange gravitational pull that madness sometimes exerts on those nearby. But even in the throes of delusion, Charles remained a king, and kings must entertain. At court, the line between festivity and disaster was razor-thin. One night, during a masquerade, the line vanished altogether. It was called the Ball of the Burning Men. Charles and his companions dressed in wild man costumes covered in pitch and flax, danced by torchlight. The idea was whimsical. The execution was tragic. A spark caught. Flames erupted. The costumes turned to kindling. Men screamed and burned. Some died in agony, writhing on the floor. Charles survived, barely, but his dignity did not. It was spectacle turned horror, and it left a scar on both the court and the king. And still, somehow, in the quiet corridors of that smoldering reign, Charles managed to father children, 12 of them. No one quite knows how. Perhaps there were moments of lucidity, or perhaps routine carried on regardless of the mind's condition. There is little evidence he remembered all their names, or that they understood the father behind the title. One wonders if they saw him as a parent or as the delicate man wrapped in cloth who feared the floor might swallow him. Charles reigned for 42 years, but it is more accurate to say he occupied the throne while France endured him. His madness was not the kind that faded or healed. It came in waves, sometimes vanishing for months, only to return with fresh hallucinations and deeper isolation. His rule was punctuated by civil war, by internal conflict, and by the endless question of who was really in charge. Charles, his wife, his mistress, or his demons. In the end, his legacy is not one of governance or glory. It is a cautionary tale of how fragile power can be when the mind falters. He was a monarch who walked like glass and ruled like mist, there, but never fully present. Peter of Castile was a man who divided history even more deeply than he divided his lovers. Some called him Peter the Just, others Peter the Cruel. Which name he earned depended largely on whether you stood beside him or beneath the floorboards after a midnight betrayal. He ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369, an age soaked in both poetry and blood. In Peter's world, romance and execution walked hand in hand, and loyalty was measured in how long your head stayed attached to your shoulders. His early years were marked not by scandal, but by an obsessive, near-fatal kind of love. Maria de Padilla, a noble woman of sharp mind and whispered influence, was the heart of his world. Some say he married her in secret. Others say she held his devotion without need for vows. Whatever the truth, her presence haunted every decision he made. When courtiers tried to steer him toward politically advantageous marriages, he nodded, smiled, and then locked the new brides in towers. Literally. One of them was Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess. Her wedding was a grand diplomatic gesture meant to unify kingdoms. 3 days later, she was imprisoned in a lonely castle where she would remain for the rest of her life. Her crime? She was not Maria. That was enough. Peter never forgave rivals for standing where Maria had once smiled, and he never truly loved anyone who wasn't her. Maria's influence outlived her own breath. When she died, Peter mourned as though the sun itself had been extinguished. He wept in public, dressed in black, and then, perhaps to silence gossip, or perhaps out of genuine madness, he declared her his one true wife, posthumously. It wasn't just sentimental. It was strategic, a retroactive coronation meant to justify every child they had conceived out of wedlock, and every noble insulted by her elevation. She had 4 of his children, and in death he made her their queen. But love in Peter's hands was not tender. It was possessive, violent, and often terminal. Donna Juana, one of his many lovers, attempted to leave him. Days later, her body was found in pieces. This was not a man who understood rejection. It wasn't only lovers who suffered. Enemies vanished, cousins disappeared. Entire bloodlines grew thin under his suspicion. Some say he watched executions from his balcony, a chalice in hand and a mistress on his lap, as if observing theater. Peter had a talent for turning romance into politics, and politics into vendetta. His court was a parade of scandal. grand feasts that ended in argument, alliances that dissolved by mourning, servants who vanished between wine courses. Gossip moved faster than decrees. His ideas of romantic gesture included sudden weddings, abrupt annulments, and occasionally the quiet scrape of a blade in the dark. Yet amid the violence, Peter ruled, and at times ruled well. He defended royal authority against rebellious nobles and tried to centralize power in a kingdom where chaos had long worn the crown. There was a method to his fury. Justice, to Peter, was personal. Those who pleased him flourished. Those who didn't disappeared. That binary view made him feared and occasionally admired. He punished corruption, elevated the loyal, and responded to betrayal with surgical ruthlessness. But every reign, no matter how iron-willed, meets its fracture. Peter's came not from a foreign army or peasant revolt, but from within his own blood. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, saw the writing on the wall, or perhaps on the dungeon walls, where Peter kept so many of his problems. Henry rose up, gathering support from nobles who had grown tired of Peter's unpredictable tyranny. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. The two met, not in court, but on a battlefield where swords replaced legal arguments. Peter was captured. In a final twist of family drama worthy of tragedy, Henry stabbed him to death with his own hand. A king undone not by his enemies, but by his kin. Some say Peter's last words were curses. Others say he died in silence, eyes wide with disbelief that anyone would dare strike him. In the years that followed, his legacy split in two. Some remembered him as a harsh but fair ruler, a man who tried to bring order to a lawless land. Others remembered only the blood, the broken vows, and the lingering perfume of dead mistresses. He left behind no clear moral, only the echo of a man who ruled with his heart, clutched in one hand and a dagger in the other. Edward II was born into power, but he wore the crown as though it were a costume borrowed from a play he didn't quite understand. He ruled England from 1307 to 1327, and in those two tumultuous decades, he managed to turn the royal court into something between a romantic tragedy and a political farce. His reign is remembered not for great military victories or sweeping reforms, but for something far more intimate, and in medieval England, far more controversial: his unwavering devotion to a man named Piers Gaveston. Piers was no ordinary courtier. He was Edward's companion, his confidant, and, according to many chroniclers of the time, something far deeper. They had known each other since boyhood, and when Edward inherited the throne, he elevated Piers with a speed and affection that stunned and, frankly, infuriated the nobility. Titles, lands, jewelry, lavish tokens of devotion passed from king to favorite without pause or subtlety. At the coronation, Gaveston didn't just attend. He dazzled, outshining the queen herself in garments that glittered like a challenge. The queen in question, Isabella of France, daughter of a powerful dynasty, arrived in England expecting a crown and a partner in rule. What she found was a husband emotionally tethered to another man. The political marriage soured quickly. Her dowry, her lineage, her diplomatic weight, none of it seemed to matter. Edward was consumed with Piers. The court whispered, the barons plotted, and Edward ignored them all. When the pressure mounted, the nobles demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward relented, reluctantly, theatrically. But as soon as the ink dried on the order, Gaveston was quietly summoned back. It was a royal tantrum disguised as statecraft, and it played out again and again. Like teenagers in love, the king and his favorite clung to each other despite the rising outrage. Eventually, the nobility took matters into their own hands. Gaveston was captured, tried in a mock tribunal, and executed. His head was cut from his shoulders and sent as a message. England belonged to no man's whims. Edward was shattered, publicly completely. He donned mourning clothes. He wept openly. His grief bled through every royal decree. But it did not bring him wisdom. Instead of retreating into reflection, he found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man who made Gaveston look like a subtle footnote in history. Where Piers had been flamboyant, Hugh was ruthless. He wasn't content with affection. He wanted authority. Edward, still wounded from loss, handed it to him. Lands, titles, even entire regions of England came under Hugh's control. It was less favoritism and more a coup under velvet robes. The nobles seethed. The Queen, Isabella, transformed from a sidelined wife to a storm gathering on the horizon, denied her rightful influence, and watching Despenser rise unchecked, Isabella began to orchestrate her revenge. While Edward clung to Hugh, Isabella sailed to France, ostensibly on diplomatic business. But in truth, she was gathering forces, allies, and a lover. Roger Mortimer, a nobleman turned rebel, became her partner not only in romance, but in revolution. When she returned, it wasn't quietly. It was with an army. England, weary of Edward's neglect and Despenser's greed, turned against its king. The invasion was swift, almost bloodless. Hugh Despenser was captured, tried, and executed in a spectacle of brutality designed to erase him from history. Edward himself was dethroned, imprisoned, and left to rot in the shadows of the same castles he once ruled from. His death remains shrouded in mystery. The most infamous version, grisly and whispered, claims he was murdered by red-hot iron in a place no man should suffer. Historians debate the veracity of that tale, but what matters more is why it lingers. It reflects the sense of punishment, the appetite for vengeance, the belief that Edward had broken too many rules, of war, of loyalty, of love, and had to pay a price worthy of his sins. Edward II's reign was not defined by armies or treaties, but by emotion. His passions ran deeper than his policies. His inability to separate the crown from his affections turned court politics into a dangerous love triangle. In a world ruled by appearances, he chose intimacy. In a world demanding strength, he offered devotion, and in doing so, he lost everything. Yet there is something tragic in his downfall. He was a king who loved, fiercely, naively, recklessly. He mistook his position for protection, believing perhaps that power could shield him from consequence. But history rarely shows mercy to those who forget its rules. And in the end, Edward II became a cautionary tale of loyalty misplaced, of favoritism weaponized, and of how a heart, when placed above the crown, can shatter both. Wenceslaus of Bohemia was a king who wore his crown more like a drinking cap than a symbol of divine rule. Born into privilege, crowned with ceremony, and given titles that would have impressed even the most jaded of courtiers, King of Bohemia, King of the Romans, he seemed destined for greatness. But destiny, like sobriety, was something Wenceslaus often misplaced. At first, he gave people reason to hope. He was young, articulate, sharp-witted. He spoke multiple languages. He could hold his own in a council chamber. But somewhere between coronation and collapse, he took a long detour into excess. Not the kind of excess written in gold leaf and velvet, but the kind that ended with overturned tables, wine-stained scrolls, and court meetings held in the fog of last night's mead. Wenceslaus didn't simply enjoy drink. He governed with it. Policy discussions became tavern brawls in disguise. Ministers learned to carry flasks, not for themselves, but to coax the king into coherence. Diplomacy in his court was often derailed by slurred speeches and inappropriate rhymes. Once, during a royal conference meant to address trade tariffs, he reportedly challenged a foreign ambassador to a duel with breadsticks. The ambassador declined. The breadsticks did not survive. he developed a taste for long, indulgent feasts that stretched into multi-day affairs. While Europe burned, Wenceslaus toasted. While nobles petitioned for reform, he staggered down palace halls in search of another barrel or another barmaid. And when wine failed to satisfy, he resorted to spectacle. At times, he would strip off his garments mid-meeting and deliver edicts in nothing but a sword belt and righteous confidence. According to one scribe, the king believed that clothing was for cowards and that true authority came not from robes but from audacity. Romance in his life followed no greater logic. He had a wife, but his attention drifted more often to tavern girls, laundresses, and the occasional noblewoman whose beer recommendations were more compelling than her pedigree. His affairs were so frequent and so public that the royal court stopped reacting. At one point, a duke accused Wenceslaus of seducing his sister. The king reportedly offered the man a drink in response. It's unclear if it was an apology or an invitation to join him. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, the court kept functioning, barely. While Wenceslaus drank and disrobed, others governed. His advisers and family patched together a kind of proxy administration, one that allowed the king to remain king without doing much of anything kingly. It was monarchy in name, chaos in practice, but eventually the Holy Roman Empire had enough. A ruler who skipped council meetings to chase imaginary horses down the palace corridors was no longer tenable. He was deposed as king of the Romans in what historians would later call a graceful removal, though it resembled more a family intervention staged by an empire. Even his brother Sigismund, a man not known for his own moderation, called Wenceslaus useless, undressed, and usually unconscious. Still, Wenceslaus clung to the Bohemian throne like a man too drunk to notice the bar had closed. Remarkably, he held it for decades, perhaps because he was seen as harmless, perhaps because no one else wanted the job, or perhaps because the people of Bohemia had grown used to his wild unpredictability. They didn't expect a ruler. They expected a spectacle, and Wenceslaus always delivered. He died as he had lived, suddenly, unrepentantly, and with more questions than answers. His kingdom was left wobbly, his palace wine cellar flooded, and his legacy ambiguous. He wasn't a tyrant nor a genius. He didn't burn cities or lead armies. What he did was stumble through history, leaving behind anecdotes instead of achievements. Wenceslaus ruled like every day was the morning after a forgotten feast. He governed by instinct, impulse, and intoxication. And in a strange way, he became a legend, not because he conquered lands or rewrote laws, but because he made monarchy feel absurd, human, and tragically hilarious. Henry VIII did not walk into history. He thundered into it, a towering man with a taste for grandeur and a bottomless appetite for power, for control, for affection. He ruled England from 1509 to 1547, and in those years his reign would fracture a religion, upend a dynasty, and leave behind a trail of broken vows, severed heads, and hastily rewritten laws. He wasn't content to simply wear the crown. He devoured it, reshaped it, and demanded the world bend to its weight. At the heart of his story is a simple obsession, the desperate need for a male heir. That singular goal would become the gravity around which his entire rule revolved. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, bore him a daughter, Mary, but no sons survived infancy. After 2 decades of marriage, Henry became convinced this lack of a male child was not misfortune, but divine punishment. God, he believed, was angry. The solution? Divorce the queen and start again. But the Catholic Church, keeper of Europe's spiritual order, refused. A pope could not simply undo a royal marriage because a king was restless. Henry's response was not humility or patience. It was revolution. He tore England from Rome, declared himself head of the Church, and forged a new religious order not out of theology, but out of stubborn desire. The English Reformation wasn't born in dusty scripture. It was born in a king's bedroom. Into that void stepped Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, a woman who captured the king's mind with wit and his heart with challenge. She refused to be a mistress. She wanted a crown, and Henry gave it to her, along with expectations. When she gave birth to Elizabeth, a healthy, brilliant daughter, Henry's initial joy turned to anxiety. No son, no security. The shadow of disappointment returned. Anne's enemies, never few, whispered accusations into the king's ears: adultery, treason, witchcraft. Whether Henry believed them or merely needed a reason to be rid of her is unclear, but the result was decisive. Anne Boleyn, once adored, was tried and executed. She died on a scaffold built not just of wood, but of suspicion and royal convenience. Her eyes were calm, her neck was not spared. Henry did not grieve long. Jane Seymour, his third wife, stepped into the role and gave him what he craved: a son, Edward. For a brief moment, the king seemed satisfied, but joy was cruelly short-lived. Jane died from complications shortly after childbirth. This time, the king mourned deeply, but even grief could not delay the machinery of succession. Next came Anne of Cleves. Chosen from a portrait, Henry met her in person and recoiled. He called her unattractive, like a Flemish mare. The marriage was annulled in months, more business transaction than love affair. Anne fared better than her predecessors. She kept her head, a pension, and a comfortable estate. In Henry's court, that was practically a win. Then there was Catherine Howard, young, vibrant, and disastrously indiscreet. She was everything Henry no longer was: energetic, flirtatious, alive. Her affairs, real or rumored, became her undoing. When the truth reached the king, he reacted not with rage, but with something worse: cold detachment. She was tried, condemned, and beheaded. The fifth wife gone. Finally came Catherine Parr, a woman of intellect and restraint. She was more nurse than consort, tending to a king swollen with disease and paranoia, whose body ached from gout and whose moods shifted like storms. She survived not by pleasing Henry, but by managing him. She read scriptures to him, she flattered his ego, and she wisely kept her thoughts private. It was enough to outlive him. By the time Henry died, England was a different kingdom. Its church was severed from Rome. Its coffers were depleted by wars and whims. Its court had seen more executions than marriages. He left behind 3 children by 3 different women, and none of them would rule easily. His legacy was not stability, but disruption. And yet Henry VIII remains one of the most remembered monarchs in history, not because he ruled wisely, but because he ruled loudly. He was both architect and wrecking ball. He broke hearts, treaties, and the very soul of English religion in pursuit of his own will. To some, he was a visionary; to others, a tyrant. To all, he was impossible to ignore. He did not fade from history. He left claw marks on its walls. Francis I did not merely rule France. He performed it. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1515, the court became his stage, his kingdom a canvas, and himself the starring figure in a Renaissance drama written in silk, flirtation, and spectacle. He was everything a medieval king was not supposed to be: charming where others were stern, romantic where others were restrained, and so relentlessly magnetic that even his enemies found themselves drawn in, if not into his arms, then certainly into his orbit. To the world, he was the perfect Renaissance monarch. He welcomed poets and painters like old friends. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to spend his final years in France, carried the great man's works home like trophies, and turned his palaces into living museums of grandeur and grace. He commissioned gardens, galleries, libraries. He redefined elegance and carried the air of a man destined to be remembered. But behind all the art and idealism was a very different story. For Francis, Ruling was a form of seduction, and seduction a form of diplomacy. His court glittered not only with gold, but with desire. It became a finely tuned dance floor where alliances were made and undone through a whisper, a glance, or a shared night beneath embroidered sheets. His taste in women was legendary, not for its subtlety, but for its scale. He pursued noble women, foreign dignitaries' wives, courtly maidens, and the occasional tavern beauty with the same fervor he applied to politics. The line between mistress and minister was often impossible to trace. He employed ladies-in-waiting not merely for their etiquette, but for their eligibility. A royal appointment to serve near the king often meant being drafted into the front lines of romantic diplomacy. Francis once famously declared to a foreign envoy that French kings were expected to be skilled lovers, as if it were a constitutional clause. He wasn't exaggerating. He treated amorous conquest as national duty, and the consequences? Entire treaties crumbled because the king had seduced someone's wife, or perhaps because someone's wife had seduced him. His most enduring affair was with Françoise de Foix, a noble woman whose wit could match his own and whose patience must have been divine. She was not just a dalliance, she was an unofficial queen in everything but title, consulted on matters of court and often seated near the king in public. But court life was fickle. Eventually, even Françoise gave way to a new favorite, Anne de Pisseleu de Hailly, a woman whose name whispered through the palace halls like perfume. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and just calculating enough to survive. Francis didn't hide his affairs. He flaunted them. They were part of his brand. Where other monarchs kept their lovers in shadows and silence, Francis paraded his around gilded chambers, seating them beside ambassadors, allowing them to weigh in on policy. For some, it was exhilarating. For others, humiliating. Foreign envoys wrote home more about the king's bedroom than his battlefield. Even the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, once remarked that Francis was more dangerous with a bed than with a sword. He meant it as an insult. Francis, undoubtedly, took it as praise. And yet, in the midst of all this indulgence, he ruled with effectiveness. His wars, though expensive, expanded France's cultural and territorial influence. His policies modernized the court and centralized royal power. He laid the groundwork for what would become France's golden age. His legacy, while cluttered with scandals and broken hearts, also bore the fingerprints of a visionary. He wasn't a tyrant. He was a flirt with a crown, a dreamer with a sword, and a monarch who believed that pleasure and power were not only compatible, but inseparable. His reign was a whirlwind of artistry, diplomacy, seduction, and perfume. He governed not by force, but by fascination. He didn't command loyalty, he captivated it. In the end, Francis I remains one of France's most unforgettable kings, not because he followed the rule-book of kingship, but because he rewrote it, line by scented line. Alfonso VI of Castile ruled with a sword in one hand and his heart firmly planted in the arms of another man's daughter. He wore the crown of Castile from 1312 to 1350, navigating the storms of medieval politics, war, and plague. But while other kings sought glory on the battlefield or built cathedrals to legacy, Alfonso was building something else entirely, an unofficial royal dynasty with a woman who wasn't his queen. His wife, Maria of Portugal, was born for royalty. She had the bloodline, the alliances, the political weight that should have made her central to the Castilian throne. But to Alfonso, she was a formality, required by treaty, ignored by choice. He spent almost no time with her, shared few words and fewer affections. If her face appears in the records, it is usually beside the words absent or neglected. She might have worn the crown, but it came with no influence. The true queen of Alfonso's world was Leonor de Guzman. She was never officially crowned, never recognized in papal decrees, and yet She ruled the court with the ease of someone who knew exactly how much power affection could carry. Leonor was no fleeting mistress. She was a force, intelligent, commanding, and relentlessly present. She bore Alfonso 11 children. 11. In an age when monarchs were expected to hide their extramarital affairs in candlelit corners, Alfonso built palaces for his mistress and held audiences with her at his side. Where Maria sat silent during ceremonies, Leonor spoke with confidence behind closed doors. She advised on political strategy, negotiated treaties, and managed her own small kingdom within the court. Her apartments were not tucked away in some distant castle. They were placed within reach of the throne. Her children were not forgotten. They were raised with titles, land, and ambition. Foreign envoys whispered about her openly. Nobles took sides. Some swore allegiance to the legitimate queen. Others quietly aligned themselves with Leonor, knowing where the king's favor truly rested. And Alfonso? He made no apologies. He paraded his mistress at royal events, kissed her hand at banquets, and allowed her to act with the authority of a royal consort. His affection wasn't a scandal. It was policy. But love that publicly humiliates has a cost. Maria's father, the King of Portugal, was not amused by his daughter's treatment. Tensions flared. Diplomatic relations soured. At one point, war loomed, not over territory, but over insult. Alfonso didn't care. He had Leonor, and that was enough. Had fate not intervened, this arrangement might have continued indefinitely. But in 1350, the Black Death swept through Europe like a scythe through wheat. It came for peasants, nobles, and kings alike. Alfonso, ever the soldier, was leading a campaign against the Moors when the plague found him. He died in camp, abruptly, unceremoniously, far from the woman he adored and the court he had so thoroughly scandalized. With the king dead, the balance of power shifted. Maria, long sidelined, returned with fury sharpened by years of humiliation. She had Leonor arrested, imprisoned, and executed. There was no trial, no reprieve. It was not justice, it was vengeance. Cold and precise, the kind that simmers over decades of neglect. Historians call it retribution. Others might call it long overdue. In the end, Alfonso Thum is remembered as a warrior king, a ruler who held the line against foreign enemies and maintained order within his realm. But beneath that legacy lies another truth. He was a king who ignored his queen, elevated his mistress, and redrew the map of royal intimacy in a way that made Europe take notice. He loved as boldly as he ruled, and when death came, it was not for love or for politics, it was for the very flesh that kings believed made them untouchable. Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, had a face that belonged on a coin, symmetrical, stern, and unyielding. His features were so clean, so sculpted, that even his enemies grudgingly admitted he looked every bit the king. But behind that marble expression, behind the cold blue eyes that never flickered, was a man for whom appearances mattered far more than truth. He didn't rule with charisma or with warmth. He ruled with precision, with control, and when necessary, with silence sharp enough to wound. He came to power in 1285, and on paper, he was a model of piety. Outwardly, Philip devoted himself to the church, championed moral reform, and presented the image of a monarch aligned with divine will. His court was clean, austere, and disciplined, at least in the sunlight. But just beneath that polished surface, a very different reality simmered. Philip's idea of morality had little to do with fairness. He demanded it from others, but reserved exceptions for himself and his closest allies. He was rigid in justice, but flexible in secrets. His true skill wasn't administration. It was manipulation. And nowhere did this show more clearly than in the most infamous royal scandal of his reign. It began innocently enough. or at least with a whisper. His daughter, Isabella, young, brilliant, and sharp as a dagger, returned home from her marriage to Edward II of England with disturbing rumors. Her sisters-in-law, wives of Philip's sons, were reportedly entertaining certain knights a little too often and a little too intimately. Their behavior wasn't just unseemly, it was dangerous. Adultery in the royal family wasn't a private sin, it was a political earthquake. Philip didn't hesitate. He launched an investigation with the subtlety of a thunderclap. Servants were questioned. Chambers searched. Eventually, 2 young knights were arrested and tortured until their confessions spilled out, broken and bloody. The details were salacious. Secret gifts, hidden trysts in towers, veils slipped aside under moonlight. Philip made no effort to contain the scandal. He turned it into spectacle. The women, his own daughters-in-law, were publicly condemned. Their hair was shorn, their titles stripped. They were paraded through the streets before being locked away in convent prisons, their shame echoing in every church sermon for months. The knights were executed, not quietly but brutally, flayed, broken, and burned in the public square, while crowds looked on in horror and awe.
But even as he enforced this brutal justice, rumors swirled that Philip himself kept a carefully curated collection of mistresses hidden within the Louvre's labyrinthine corridors. Some whispered he even used them to entertain visiting dignitaries, cloaking diplomacy in scented sheets and lowered candlelight. Of course, no charges were brought against the king. In his world, sin became strategy the moment he committed it. Philip also had a particular gift for using religion when it suited him. Nowhere was this more evident than in his crusade against the Knights Templar. On the surface, he claimed to be defending the church from heresy, but everyone knew the truth. He was after their gold. The Templars were wealthy, powerful, and independent, 3 things Philip could not tolerate. So he spun a tale of blasphemy, devil worship, and secret rituals, none of which required evidence, only fear. On a single morning in 1307, across the kingdom, Templars were arrested in sweeping silence, tortured until their confessions matched the script, their lands seized, their leaders burned, and all under the approving eye of a pope whom Philip had personally maneuvered into office. Divine justice, he called it. In truth, it was a hostile takeover in holy robes. Philip governed like a man obsessed with tidiness, tidy records, tidy morality, tidy eliminations. He wore virtue like armor but used it as a blade. He wanted a France that obeyed, that knelt, that feared him enough not to look too closely. And for a time he got it. He broke no laws, he simply rewrote them. He spilled no blood unjustly, he simply defined what just meant. He died in 1314, suddenly and without warning. According to legend, it happened shortly after the execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, who cursed both Philip and the Pope as flames consumed him. Within a year both men were dead. Coincidence, perhaps, or justice finally served in fire instead of ink. Philip IV was not a monster in the traditional sense. He was far more unsettling. He was a man who believed in order above all else, who saw emotion as weakness, who turned loyalty into chains and silence into power. His legacy is not stained with scandal because he buried the stains so deep they turned to marble. He left behind no poetry, no love stories, no grand epics. Only an empire quietly sharpened beneath a mask of piety, and a warning that the fairest faces often hide the darkest ambitions. Sigismund of Luxembourg ruled like a man who could never quite keep up with his own ambitions. Crowned in pieces, first as King of Hungary, then of Germany, then Bohemia, and finally as Holy Roman Emperor, he seemed determined to collect titles like a gambler trying to recover losses. His life was a blur of crowns, councils, and contradictions, as if he had stepped into the role of emperor not to command history but to chase it. At first glance, Sigismund looked the part. He was tall, striking, and dressed with flair. His beard was famously red, his armor gleaming, and his court filled with the kind of loud, lavish pageantry that masked the slow erosion of authority underneath. He spoke several languages, issued elegant decrees, and had a talent for grand gestures. But beneath the brocade and ceremonial Latin, Sigismund was often lost in the very machinery of the empire he was meant to lead. He was born into power but not into clarity. His reign was a puzzle box of shifting alliances, religious crises, and internal chaos. He spent much of his life wandering from city to city, castle to castle, trying to hold together a patchwork empire that didn't want to be stitched. And wherever he went, scandal followed like a page boy with too much to carry. His romantic life was less regal than reckless. He married Mary of Hungary, a queen in her own right, and for a while it seemed like a political match that might evolve into genuine partnership. But after her sudden death, some said from grief, others from exhaustion, Sigismund showed little desire for traditional marriage. He preferred women who didn't come with crowns attached. One of his most infamous relationships was with a certain Sille noblewoman, whose influence over him was so great that courtiers began calling her the true empress, despite the lack of ceremony or consent from the pope. Mistresses were not rare in royal courts, but Sigismund treated his like advisors, scribes, and sometimes generals. He entrusted them with sensitive matters, much to the horror of the male-dominated councils that surrounded him. When challenged, he would smirk and quote poetry. "A loyal woman," he once said, "can outthink a room full of bishops." And perhaps he believed it, but while his passions raged behind palace doors, the real fire was burning in Christendom. The church was splintering under the weight of competing popes, 3 of them, at one point, each claiming to be the true vicar of Christ. The world looked to Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, to settle the matter. He called a grand council at Constance in 1414, an unprecedented gathering of religious and political leaders from across Europe. It was supposed to heal the schism, restore order, and reassert imperial strength. What it became was a theater of betrayal. Among the attendees was Jan Hus, a Czech reformer whose sermons had shaken the church with dangerous ideas, calls for simplicity, for reform, for a return to the moral center. Sigismund promised him safe passage, personally, signed and sealed. Hus believed him. He arrived at the council under that imperial protection, and then Sigismund broke his word. Hus was arrested, tried, and condemned as a heretic. He was burned at the stake while Sigismund watched, his promise already crumpled into ash. When challenged on this betrayal, the emperor offered a chilling justification. No promise can hold against heresy. In that moment, diplomacy died and rebellion was born. The flames of Hus's execution sparked what would become the Hussite Wars, a brutal, prolonged uprising in Bohemia. And once again, Sigismund found himself chasing control he never fully possessed. For years, he tried to put down the rebellion. For years, he failed. His authority in Bohemia was little more than a rumor during that time. And yet he pressed on, always moving, always talking, always hoping the next decree would fix what the last war had broken. He founded universities, reformed imperial laws, and kept trying to be the emperor history seemed unwilling to let him become. He didn't lack ideas. He lacked permanence. Everything he built was either unfinished, contested, or erased by conflict. Sigismund died in 1437, exhausted and largely ignored by the very nobles who had once chanted his name. His body was laid to rest with full imperial honors, surrounded by banners that bore the weight of titles he'd spent a lifetime collecting, but rarely commanding. In the end, Sigismund of Luxembourg was not a villain. He wasn't even a failure, not in the traditional sense. He was a man caught between centuries, born into an age of fragmentation and trying, desperately, flamboyantly, to weave it back together. He ruled with poetry when war was needed. He made promises where silence would have been safer. He thought himself a peacemaker. History remembered him as a footnote in a storm he couldn't calm. Christian VII of Denmark was born to be king, but not to rule. From the moment he inherited the crown in 1766, it was clear that something inside him flickered rather than burned. His gaze wandered, his speech twisted into nonsense, and his behavior was so erratic that even courtiers trained to endure madness behind velvet curtains began to whisper in alarm. Christian was not simply eccentric, he was ill, and no title, no crown, no ceremony could cover what the royal physicians refused to say aloud. Their king was mentally unwell. At first, there was hope it could be managed. After all, Denmark had ministers, councils, and tradition to do the work of governance. Christian only had to smile, wave, and sit still long enough for treaties to be signed in his name. But Christian couldn't sit still. He twitched, muttered to himself, and often fled official ceremonies mid-sentence. He delighted in slapping nobles across the face without warning, and would sometimes bark like a dog to confuse his staff. He once locked himself in a room for days, convinced the furniture was plotting against him. His courtiers tried to hide his condition behind layers of protocol. When that failed, they looked for a solution not in medicine, but in marriage. Perhaps, they thought, a good queen could anchor him. That role fell to Caroline Matilda, the 15-year-old sister of King George III of England. She was young, beautiful, and utterly unprepared for what awaited her in Copenhagen. Their marriage was doomed from the start. Christian vacillated between childlike adoration and cruel indifference. He mocked her in public, ignored her in private, and at times seemed to forget she was his wife at all. He preferred the company of his favorites, young men who flattered him, indulged his whims, and enabled his descent into paranoia and fantasy. But Caroline, unlike her husband, was not easily erased. Intelligent and increasingly desperate, she found solace not in the arms of the king but in his physician. Johann Friedrich Struensee was no ordinary doctor. He was enlightenment incarnate, rational, ambitious, and hungry for power. Appointed to care for the king's mind, he swiftly realized that the best way to help Christian was to rule in his stead. With quiet precision, Struensee became the power behind the throne. He issued laws, dismissed ministers, and restructured the Danish court, all under the royal seal. He also began a secret love affair with the queen. It was passion and rebellion tangled together. In Struensee, Caroline found the affection she had never received from her husband. In Caroline, Struensee found a queen who believed in his reforms, and who carried enough legitimacy to protect him, at least for a while. The king, meanwhile, drifted in and out of awareness. Sometimes he raged against shadows. Other times he offered Struensee his complete trust, even as the doctor signed away royal authority. It was rule by proxy, and for a brief moment it worked. Denmark became a laboratory of Enlightenment reform. Censorship lifted, torture banned, education expanded. But no revolution arrives without cost. The nobility, humiliated and displaced, waited for their moment. Rumors spread of foreign manipulation, of heresy, of seduction. The idea of a German doctor in bed with the queen and in control of the king was too much. A conspiracy formed. In a cold early morning raid, Struensee was arrested in his bed. Caroline was dragged from her chambers. The king, confused and frightened, reportedly applauded, then wept. Struensee was tried, tortured, and executed in public. His body was torn apart as a warning. Caroline was exiled, stripped of title, and sent away from her children, never to return. And Christian, he remained king, but never truly returned to himself. He spent the rest of his life as a shadow monarch, wandering the corridors of his palace in fits of laughter and silence. Denmark was ruled by regents, first his stepmother, then his son. The court never again allowed madness so close to power. Christian VII became a symbol, not of tyranny nor greatness, but of fragility. He showed what happens when the divine right to rule falls into hands trembling with fear and confusion. He was a man born to sit on a throne, but not to carry its weight. In the end, his reign was remembered not for what he did, but for what was done around him. He was a king who lived in a storm of voices. his crown balancing precariously atop a mind slowly unraveling. Charles II of Spain was born a king but shaped like a curse. From the moment he emerged into the world in 1661, the court whispered prayers instead of cheers. His jaw was misshapen, his limbs frail, his speech delayed, his mind a flicker behind sunken eyes. The Habsburg blood that flowed through his veins, once the pride of empire, had turned thick with centuries of intermarriage. He was, in the cruel judgment of nature and nobility alike, a child not of destiny, but of decline. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, not in admiration but in desperation. When medicine failed to explain his afflictions, courtiers turned to superstition. Surely, they reasoned, no ordinary child could suffer so grotesquely unless cursed by demons, witches, or God himself. Every twitch, every convulsion, every empty stare became a sign of sorcery. And so the boy grew not in a home, but in a haunted house of suspicion and fear. Charles could barely chew his food. His oversized tongue and deformed jaw made speech almost impossible. He drooled, stumbled, and spoke like a man trapped inside himself. He was kept hidden for much of his youth, swaddled in layers of silk and denial. Tutors came and went. None made progress. Ministers offered prayers. Doctors prescribed exorcisms. But the truth remained. Charles II was not fit to rule. And yet, rule he did. When he inherited the throne at age 4, regents took over in his name. Even when he reached adulthood, it was never clear if Charles truly understood the affairs of his empire. Spain, once a titan under his forebears, was now crumbling. Gold from the New World had dried up. Wars drained the treasury. Territories slipped through royal fingers like sand. And in the heart of Madrid, a frail monarch signed decrees with hands that barely held a quill. His court became a theater of vultures. Ambitious nobles, scheming priests, foreign ambassadors, all circled the weakening king, whispering into ears that barely heard, placing documents before eyes that barely read. They fought not over policy but proximity. Whoever controlled the king controlled Spain. And Charles, he was too ill, too exhausted to resist. Some days he could not leave his bed. Other days he forgot where he was. Marriage, too, was weaponized. Twice he wed, once to a French princess, then to a German noblewoman. Both unions were meant to secure alliances and, more desperately, an heir. But his body, riddled with deformity and disease, could not fulfill that most basic duty of a king. He fathered no children. The royal bloodline, the Habsburg legacy, ended with him. He was the full stop at the end of an empire's sentence. By the 1690s, his health was so broken that even his enemies pitied him. His skin turned pale and papery. He suffered seizures. His hair fell out in patches. Food passed through him untouched. And yet he lingered, years beyond what nature should have allowed. Priests were summoned. Relics were pressed to his chest. He was exorcised multiple times, not for what he had done, but for what he was. In his final days, Charles became a living relic, more ghost than monarch. He named an heir, sparking the War of Spanish Succession before he had even taken his last breath. When he died in 1700 at the age of 38, his autopsy was so shocking it became legend. His body, the doctors reported, contained no blood, only black liquid, a heart the size of a peppercorn, and a head filled with water. He had, in truth, been dying since birth. But his death marked more than the end of a man. It marked the fall of a dynasty. The Habsburg line in Spain vanished with him, consumed by its own arrogance, its obsession with purity, and its refusal to heed the warnings of blood and bone. Charles II did not lead armies. He did not forge treaties. He did not pass laws that changed the world. His life was one of shadows, of caretakers, of whispered prayers, of locked doors and extinguished candles. And yet he stands as one of the most important monarchs in European history, not for what he did, but for what his life revealed. That even empires, like men, can rot from within.